start off that I have been clairaudient all of my life. I don't remember a time when I didn't hear voices. So, and I've had a lifetime of non-ordinary experiences, as you call them, and it covered a bit of everything, mediumship, precognition, all sorts of different things, ghosts and psychic predictions, and yeah, a bit of everything. And I used to just think I was pretty much a spiritual jack of all trades. I didn't have a specialty as such. I just could do a bit of everything when I needed to, or when it actually just happened. And in 2009, I was told by a voice to write down as many of my odd experiences as I could. And these included UFOs and ETs, I might add. So I did. I wrote it all down in a little book that's not available anymore, Strange Tales of an Ordinary Life, and then got on with it. And in 2010, I, much against my will, began a shamanic apprenticeship. And things started to really ramp up in terms of strange happenings. And I realised that the 2009 instruction to write a book had been done because I was in danger of forgetting. So many things were happening. I was in danger of forgetting things that had happened earlier in my life that were really wonderful. Now, I was asked to talk about all of these things and about my books today, and I will. The books do come into this, but something, as often happens in my life, came out of left field a bit, and it's got a bit revamped, and we're going to be talking a fair bit about Saint Stephen. So around 2012, 2013, I began to hear small poems and sentences that were to do with wisdom. I'd always been fascinated with wisdom. Like, what was it? Even as a child, I just loved the word wisdom. It sounded so wonderful. Wisdom, what is that, you know? I was getting things about spiritual matters, all sorts of stuff. Dream poetry, so poetry in my dreams. I think in 2018 I had a wonderful poem on death from Rudyard Kipling that's in one of the books. And contacts with other intelligences just kept happening. And I had new entities turning up to guide and instruct me all through this time. And in 2016, I met Saint Stephen. And you can read the full story and part 2 of this story on my blog page, which we'll put in the chat later. But I'm going to read a little bit from both accounts now. So in 2016, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'll have to put my glasses on. And just decided to indulge myself in a shamanic journey. And as often happens, I was immediately asleep again and dreaming, but now lucid. So that meant I was aware that I was dreaming in the dream. And I found myself in the cave in the company of a lovely, gentle man dressed as a monk in a brown hooded robe. Outside it was snowing. There was a large bath-sized well in the middle of the cave, and it was filled with golden water. And I hear that I'm at the sacred well of the saints in the Himalayas. And I wonder if that includes all the saints of the world from all traditions, or just the Tibetan ones. And a voice tells me that it is all the saints. In the back wall of that cave, which itself has a golden glow, is an opening. The monk, who I learn is Saint Stephen, beckons me to follow him through that hole in the wall, and we pass through it and journey just a little way into a beautiful wild valley, protected inside a ring of mountains, and the land is green and lush and flourishing. A small bird flies right up to me, and it was totally unafraid, and I realised that nothing here was frightened of mankind, and that I'm in the hidden land of what we would call Shangri-La, or paradise on earth. We go back into the cave, and Stephen tells me the password to the Well of the Saints and the symbol of the well, and I'm welcome to come as often and whenever I like. And I'm made aware that I should attend regularly for arthritic hands, if nothing else. Okay, so later that day, my husband and I, we went to the movies to see the film Insurgent 2, known as Allegiant as well, I think. And towards the end of that film, one of the characters states that divergents aren't the problem in the world, they are the answer. And as somebody who's obviously neurodiverse in some way, I can really understand that. I identified with that statement. And when we left the movie, it was dark outside, Even so, I noticed there was a small object on the ground and it had rolled into a crack between two segments of paving. My intuition pulled at me and I stooped and picked it up, and in the middle of a regional city in Australia, far from the mystic land of the Himalayas, I'm holding a small brass Tibetan bell. In the weeks that followed, a lot of other things happened. I continued to be aware of Stephen and others in my life. And I met St. Caspar a year or two after this as well. I'll say right here and now that they don't like being called saint. And in fact, I had dedicated my third book to St. Caspar and St. Stephen and a few others that guide me. And I was told after it had sort of gone to the printers that I had to pay for this change to just remove the word saint, and I did. Their presence continues to this day because, as Stephen says, we are never separated from each other. We are the one thing. So that was 2016 I met Stephen. So on the 1st of October 2020, right, I submitted a request to White Crow Books that they read and accept my recent manuscript. And a chapter in that book was part one of the Sacred Well of the Saints and my meeting with St. Stephen. When I was on White Crow website, I noticed that they were the publishers of Reverend Michael Cox's book, Afterlife Teachings from Stephen the Martyr. And I had purchased this book on Amazon Kindle in March 2019. So it's very clear. I met Stephen in 16, but I found this book on Stephen in 2019. And I bought it simply because I was astounded that my St. Stephen had indeed been very active previously. In fact, to be honest, I was a little peeved. I really considered Stephen like, oh, my best friend, and here he'd been talking to a whole host of other people decades before, but never mind. I got over that. And Michael had been a part of a group that met for 8 years to talk with Stephen via a medium. Although I bought it with every intention of reading it, for some reason, I only read 10%, according to my Kindle. Now, Michael, I'll just tell you a little bit about Michael and that group. Okay, so for approximately 8 years, from 1973 to 81, I think, Reverend Michael Cox led a group of up to 12 people who attended sessions channeled by Tom Ashman, who was a medium, and they talked with an entity called St. Stephen. And Michael wrote the book that I mentioned, Afterlife Teachings, using transcripts of those sessions. The Ashmans had moved to Christchurch after they lived it. Sorry, first of all, they were in Sevenoaks in Kent. And one night, Tom Ashman's wife, Olive, had heard Tom speaking in what sounded like Latin in his sleep. And when this continued on subsequent nights, she had begun recording the words, which turned out to be profound spiritual teachings. And then and at the same time in New Zealand, Michael Cox had begun receiving prophecies from a woman in the North Island that covered many of the themes that would eventually come up in the Stephen dialogues. The Ashmans moved to Christchurch in New Zealand in 1974, and Michael Cox met Olive at a library there. And that's where it all started for them. So, following my little plan, here I am. Okay. Now, the next bit was really fascinating to me. I don't know about everybody else in the world. I've got to find where I put it. It's the only thing, which is not there. Well, that'd be right. Don't tell me I've lost it. That'd be normal. Here we go. Nope, I have lost it, which is, I don't know what I've done with that. So it was in October 2020, and we were in a dream circle. I was running a dream circle, and somebody mentioned St. Stephen. It came up, and Michael Cox and the book. And I just said that I hadn't spoken about the fact that St. Stephen was a massive contributor to everything I wrote about. And everyone knew from that chapter that, of course, I'd met him, but I'd never talked about his ongoing role. And so he turned up in Dream Group because we were talking about him, and I just said, well, that's really, you know, of significance to me that you know him and everything. And we were half an hour into the Dream Group, and within a minute in the waiting room was Michael Cox, which I was flabbergasted. I thought it was some sort of joke, but no, it was Michael Cox, and he had heard about the global gatherings, and I actually think he got the day wrong and thought he was on a global gathering, but he just wafted in right when his name had been mentioned along with St. Stephen. And from that time on, Michael and I, we just kept in touch until his death. He died not that long ago. And it was a real delight to talk with somebody else, one of the other people alive who had a lived experience of this loving guidance of Stephen. Now, at some point around 2016, I think I'd made a request to receive wisdom teachings for every day of the year, and I literally was flooded with them. And this is ongoing. The teaching I received from Stephen, Caspers and others formed part of Book 2, We Are One. The chapters concern oneness, perfection, beliefs, and the illusion of separation. And it's all written really from their understandings of what they taught me. My editor mentioned that my language was antiquated slightly. And I just felt like saying, well, that tends to happen really when you're talking with disincarnate intelligences who are 2,000 years old, if not ageless. I mean, it's a bit hard because really they do make me look up Latin and etymology of words a great deal so that I get the meaning that they want conveyed. Some people told me not to include those chapters in my book to let people come to their own conclusions. But for me, that would have been a betrayal of the people involved, the teachers that I had. So I still hesitated in mentioning that I was talking with saints. I mean, really, I know how sceptical I would have been if someone said, well, I'm talking to St. Stephen and St. Caspar. I'd have had visions of the old cartoons of the loony bin where everybody's saying, well, I'm Christ and I am, you know. So you just don't want to go out and say that. And oddly enough, I know Michael too also had misgivings about this because in a blog, I've forgotten who that one was by that you sent me, Wendy. He says that, hang on while I find it, might have been the watch. Yeah, Michael Cox was the same. They had a lot of trouble. He realised that the story is difficult for most people to accept. And he had a hard time accepting it himself. I understand that. And even after he came to believe that St. Stephen was actually communicating with the group, he was reluctant to discuss it with many people outside of the group. Part of it was fear of social ostracism for claiming to receive teaching from a saint, he explained. Part of it was my not having quite absorbed what Stephen was trying to communicate, he said. And part of it was that the meaningful coincidences that came with it, which is what the non-ordinary experiences around all of this are so, as he said, they come thick and fast. And he wrote a book about them. The same as I've written books about non-ordinary experiences. He wrote a book about them because he thought that that book would be more acceptable to the public than a seemingly improbable story about communications from a Christian saint. Man, do I identify with that? Anyway. Early this year, my iPad developed an intermittent sensitivity fault. I'd actually call it an intermittent blessing fault, but it's an intermittent sensitivity fault. When I open the Kindle up, it flashes up the afterlife teaching of Stephen the Martyr, even when I haven't left the book open and it isn't the last book I was reading. And I took the hint when it comes up and I read the book because so much there is consistent with what I've learned from Stephen. my thinking around that book and the fact that I'd only read 10% was that I would doubt my own third book if I'd have read Michael's book before I finished Little Pearls and Little Gems. I would have, the crossover is so close in essence. And about 10 days ago, I was getting ready for bed and I was thinking about this talk and whether or not I should mention the huge impact of Stephen on my writing, my wisdom work. And I had left Sheila Lowe's latest book open on the Kindle. I think it's open, called The Last Door, which is excellent, by the way. And I'd left it open on my Kindle to read before sleeping. But when I got into bed and picked up the iPad, it flashed Michael's book up at me. So I opened it obediently and came across the part where Michael talks of the group's hesitancy about talking about it. And it was then I decided that it was time that Stephen's role as a modern day teaching mystic was shared. Although in my last book I say that I didn't write the words but heard them, I never really say who speaks. Stephen speaks and he still does. Yesterday I received, via a friend of Hyacinth's, who's part of our groups, a recording of a session of Michael's group from the 31st of May 1980. And it was a beautiful thing to hear Stephen actually speak through Thomas. And it solved a little bit of a puzzle for me because I had at times questioned the apparent simplicity of what I was given in terms of the wisdom teachings in Little Pearls and Little Gems. You could read them and think, oh, that's simple. They're not. But in this recording yesterday, I heard Stephen saying that Christ had conveyed more in 5 words than he, Stephen, had in years. Stephen then said, one of the most beautiful sentences for me as the receiver and recorder of just what I heard and nothing else, even when I doubted it. He said, my words are too numerous to be sufficient to answer the question. And it was at that moment I truly appreciated the sophistication of the wisdom I'd been gifted to share in that third book, because it's been condensed so that the more words you give somebody, the more room there is for them to get lost in their own ideas and to get different perceptions of what wisdom actually is meant. And so that real condensation into just short rhymes, simple words, is an amazing tool that Stephen has used and the rest of the group have used to get across what they're trying to teach. And just before I hand over to Hyacinth, who I'd love to have a little talk about how she met Michael Cox and came across the teachings of St. Stephen herself, because to me it's just mind-blowing that somebody who not only knew the man who wrote the book but loves the teachings of Stephen was in my dream circle and my Gosh group. Even that sort of orchestration from spirit of like-minded energies to meet to help produce something that they wanted to say is just amazing. And I'm going to read to you just the tiniest little thing because, you know, I talk about wisdom more than I talk about love, and that's because of our ideas about what love might be. They can be very limiting. So this was from the 16th of October, and I'd been awake early worrying about stuff, so I decided to read Stephen from 5:30 till 7 a.m, so it was a massive sort of read. And I got up and I heard Stephen, which is what I do. I just hear a voice. And what I heard was, I cannot, under any circumstances, commit myself to anything other than love. If that's not wisdom, I don't know what is. Now, I'd like to introduce my dear, dear friend Hyacinth, who I'll be forever grateful for that recording you sent me yesterday, Hyacinth. And would you like to tell us how you met the wonderful Reverend Michael Cox and came across the teachings of Stephen? And anything else about it you want to talk about?
Yes, well, Michael came as a chaplain to the church in Gothenburg. And he made the mistake of, well, first of all, his first sermon was about David Bohm and that God is a spirit. He was very much into this, and this intrigued me. And so he made the mistake of telling me about Michael. So I said, what? So I arranged a small group of people from the church so that he could talk about Stephen. And you can imagine, here he had a safe place where he could talk about Stephen. And it was absolutely astounding. And again, when he talked about, because we went through the book with him, he was explaining all these things. And Michael, I must tell you, is an Oxford theologian, 4-generation priest. His mother was psychic, and Michael inherited it. So he had both worlds. And his book on synchronicity is Into the Wider Dream. That's the one you were mentioning. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, but it was absolutely fascinating with Stephen. And Stephen said that he would talk to them because they were basically a group of Anglicans. So he used language that they would understand. Because he said, this is what you have to be able to let people understand what you're talking about. Of course, then it was a much, much wider group with all sorts of people who were not Christians at all.
Mm.
And he was asked, and they were asking things about astrophysics and all sorts of things. It was just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And so, yes.
Yes, it really, yes. All of that orchestration to me is amazing too. Just the synchronicities, as we were saying, and
Yes.
the determination. So for me, I want to point out too that I was one of the 2 people who didn't go to religious instruction in my school. My father wouldn't have a bar of it. I wasn't brought up knowing anything about the saint. I had to research Saint Stephen when he told me who he was. So, yeah, so there was that. There's not so much of that religious context. It just goes straight for the spiritual in a lot of my stuff. Mm. So, yes.
And part of the problem with the church, and I have my little sessions with bishops, is that Stephen was saying, well, it's not quite that way, the way it worked. So that it was, and he explained a lot. So, of course, Michael had to be careful, because priests don't talk to dead saints.
No. In fact, I think he was told he was talking to the devil at some stage, wasn't he?
Yes.
Mm.
And I have to say that Jesus also came through Thomas.
Yes.
And so it was a situation where there was a thing where Jesus asked them to do something, which was a communion, really, exactly. And then said, Thomas will come and explain it to you.
Nice.
So this was absolutely, yes. And I must tell you that what Michael said was, when Stephen had a lot of jokes, and he was like a friend whom they knew.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so they talked really, but when Jesus came on the land and Jesus spoke Latin, sic ecclesia spiritus sanctus, this was the headmaster. They did not joke. So that it was really mind-blowing.
Yeah, yes, mind-blowing stuff, I know. I didn't mention the Jesus stuff. I'm glad you brought it up because it was a mind-blowing event.
Yes. And also, because Michael knew ancient Greek, he could write the words down, and he researched it. He was painstaking research.
Yes, I was just reading it. It's very dry and complicated and a difficult read for people, but basically what we're talking about here is that Stephen, to prove who he was and where he was from, spoke through Thomas in an ancient Greek dialect from a particular region. And because Michael was such a scholar, he could record it, and then he went to other scholars to research it and what it meant. And it really did show, I think without a shadow of a doubt, that Stephen was where he was from. It was just amazing.
Yes.
I was really interested that he was a mix of Celtic and Jewish people. And it was what he said when he joined the Essenes, wasn't it?
He was a member of the Essenes, yes. And the person who introduced him and sponsored his membership in the Essenes was Joseph.
Yes.
Joseph and Mary were Essenes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And something that was very interesting was that he talked about the wine that they used, the drink that they used. And it was like almost in Sweden. It was in Sweden that all of this, that was what it was, where it was sort of fermented, but it wasn't wine. It was a kind of fermented juice. It was absolutely unbelievable. The detailed research that Michael did, because as he said, I'm a priest. I can't fool people.
That's right. Yeah. And it really was amazing research. I mean, people should study that if nothing else. Although, as I said, it's long and it's dry, but it is just an amazing body of proof of the existence of the consciousness of Stephen. And he's wonderful. You know, they had Jesus. He's taken me to meet other people as well. I think, and they don't like being called saints either. It's fascinating. He introduced me to somebody called Thanos, and I looked all that up, and it was Saint Athanasius the Great or something. He was a bishop at Alexandria or forever ago. So yes, he does bring in other entities. And Casper, yeah, Casper's just amazing too. Very close to Casper. But Casper's almost more like just a really good friend who keeps an eye on my well-being, whereas Stephen's really more about massive communication of spiritual wisdom. It's the only word I've got for it. So, yes, thank you. And happy to take questions. And, yeah, both of us are, I imagine, because Hyacinth has a very long lived experience of all of this. So,
can I say that something that Michael asked about his martyrdom, that he was stoned to death.
Yes.
And he said, our Lord was merciful. It didn't last long, but it was just before his 21st birthday.
No, so young.
About it's only one of the situations where Stephen comes in and he said he was preaching. He says, oh, now I've been preaching so long. And you know what happened the last time I preached.
Yeah, he's got a great sense of humour.
He was stoned, exactly.
Yeah.